Hey, it's Greg from the Code Creative. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the CSS Scroll Snap module. And you're going to see how easy it is to use once you learn two essential properties, which I'm going to talk about here, and also demonstrate for you with an easy-to-follow code example.
Woohoo!
Now, scroll snapping is an important concept to be aware of when it comes to enhancing the user experience. So let's start off by clarifying exactly what scroll snapping is, and let's also think about it conceptually for a moment by way of a real-world example. So I'm here on this apple.com iPhone page, and if you look right here, we see this scrolling nav bar. What I want you to pay attention to right now is the behavior of the scrolling. So what I'm going to do on my mouse wheel is I'm going to scroll to the right, like so, and take a look at the menu item. Notice how when that menu item comes into view, we see it basically get snapped into place. So let me scroll again. So it might be difficult for you to tell what I'm doing because you can't see my mouse wheel, but basically I'm just scrolling to the right, and each time I do so, the next menu item just snaps right into place. So let me go to the left, and you can see it gets snapped now to the previous menu item, and again. So the effect that the snapping has is that it allows us, the developers, to take the user scrolling, which by nature is imprecise, and to make it more precise. Right? This is especially important on mobile devices because it allows the user to do a swiping action. If the user couldn't swipe, they would really have to spend time fidgeting, trying to precisely scroll their content into view. But with snapping, they can simply do a little bit more of an imprecise swipe, and the next piece of content will just lock into place, almost as though a magnet is pulling it into place. Another really popular use case for snapping is with image carousels or sliders. Here's an example I found on CodePen by Chris Coyer, in which scroll snapping is used to create this real simple slider. So in this example, we just have a series of panels which are numbered, but they could just as well be images. And for one thing, I can click on each number, and when I do, you'll see the next panel will just snap into place. And we can also see if I move the scroll bar along the x-axis here, if I just move it a little bit, and just let go, we can see that that next panel snaps neatly into place. And I'll go backwards. And we can see that very clean snapping effect, just like a magnet. Now that we have a pretty good idea of what scroll snapping is, let's find out how we can actually work with it in our code, and we'll talk about those two really important essential properties that I mentioned at the start of this video. So in my code, which I'm going to show you in a second, I've already set up just some very basic DOM elements in CSS. Here what we have in the browser is just a series of 3 panels, and you can see they each have a different color to distinguish them. And I've also added some text content, giving each one a number. And as you can see at the moment, we haven't implemented any scroll snapping just yet, right? Because if I move my scroller and I let go, well, you can see that nothing is snapping into place. What I'd like to do is when I scroll down a little bit, like if I scroll down here and let go, well, I'd like each of these panels to snap to the very top of the viewport. So let's move into our code editor right now, and let's see how we can make this happen. Let's go into VS Code, and here you can see I've got an index.html file and a style.css file. And in my index.html file, I have this outer wrapping div with the class of container, and inside of it, I have 3 divs, each one representing a panel. And in fact, I've given each one a class of panel, and I've also given each one specific panel classes of panel 1, panel 2, and panel 3, and that's just so that we can give each one a different background color in the CSS. So let's look at what else we have here in the CSS. We're starting out by giving the HTML and body elements a height of 100%. And since the browser automatically gives us some margin on the body, we're just setting it to 0 here to kind of reset it. Now here's where we get into the DOM elements that we actually created. Starting with our container, we're giving that a height of 100%. And then each panel also has a height of 100%. So basically everything has a height of 100%, and that's how we can create these panels. Right? Each one taking up 100% of the viewport. And these text align and font size properties are just to get the text in place for the panel divs. I think now it's time to introduce those 2 essential properties I told you about in order to work with scroll snapping. And here they are. The first one is called the Scroll Snap type, and the second one is called the Scroll Snap Align. And to use these properties, what we need to understand is that we're working with a parent element and child element. And that scroll snap type is going to be applied to the parent element, and the scroll snap align is going to be applied to the child elements. So in this case, our parent element is this div with the class of container. The child elements are the inner divs with the classes of panel. Now, before we set up these two properties, let's make sure that we have our overflow set to scroll on that container div. And it could be overflow Y or it could be overflow X, depending on the axis that we're working with. Now, if we look in the browser, we want to work with the overflow Y property because we're scrolling in this vertical kind of way. And you can see that scroll bar here on the right is on the Y-axis. However, we could also have a scenario where we have these panels going from left to right. And in that case, we'd be working with an overflow X scroll with the scroll on the X-axis going horizontally. So going back to our code, we want to set overflow Y to a property of scroll. And now we can use our scroll snap type property. And to start off with, we're going to set it to a value of Y and mandatory. So let me explain to you what these values do. The first value, the Y, again, is the axis of our scrolling. In this mandatory value, well, there's basically two values that we can use here. We can use mandatory or we can use proximity. Proximity actually is the default. But let me explain to you what the difference is. Basically, the difference has to do with the strictness of the snapping. So once we finish our code example, we're going to go to the browser and we're going to compare the two, mandatory and proximity. But what you should know for now is that mandatory is kind of the more forceful one of the two options. So now this takes care of the parent element. What we now have to do is use that scroll snap align property on the child elements, which are the divs with the class of panel. So let's come in here, let's do scroll snap align. And there are three values that we can put here. We can put start, or we can put center, or we can put end. And this has to do with where in the scroll container does the child element snap to. Another name for that scroll container is actually called the snap port, which is kind of a funny word. But what we're going to set here for now is start. And we'll take a look at center and end as well to compare them. So now at this point we can save, and we can go back to the browser and we should get some snapping. All right, so now I'm going to scroll down a little bit. And let's see if that second panel snaps right to the top of the viewport. So I'm going to scroll and I'm going to let go. And there we go. It snaps up to the top of the viewport just like a magnet. And let's scroll down to that third panel and see it snap as well. And there we go. Just really with those two simple properties, we've got snapping. As I promised earlier, we're now going to take a look at some of the other values you can set for scroll snap type and scroll snap align. So what we've had so far is scroll snap type set to mandatory here. And so if we take a look in the browser right now we're at the very first panel that we have. And what I'm going to do on my mouse scroll wheel is I'm going to scroll and release. And what you'll notice is that immediately that second panel is going to snap to the top of the viewport. So here I go. Right, so what I did was just a quick mouse wheel scroll to the right and I let go. And because it's set to mandatory, that next panel, it has to snap into place. And I'll do it again for the third panel. So I'm going to mouse wheel scroll to the right, and the third panel just immediately snaps into place. So we can say that out of the two options, mandatory and proximity, that mandatory is going to be the stricter one. So what we'll do is we'll compare now to proximity. And if we look at the little pop-up message that we get here in VS Code, we see that this one is going to cause snapping to occur at the discretion of the UA or user agent, given the parameters of the scroll. So this one's going to put it more in the hands of the browser to determine at what point things are going to snap. So let's save. And here I'm going to take us back to the very top. And once again, I'm going to do a quick mouse wheel scroll. And here you can see that even though I've already scrolled down a bit, we don't get that automatic snapping like we did with mandatory. But let's continue scrolling down a little bit more. And a little bit more, and then finally you see right there, close to where that second panel is, the browser decided, okay, let's snap now. So hopefully there you can see the difference between mandatory and proximity. Let's now go ahead and take a look at the other values that we can set for the scroll snap align property. And those values are going to be center and end. Before we do though, let's just go and set the scroll snap type back to mandatory, which I think will make it a little bit clearer to see. The other thing I'm going to do in order to see how the scroll snap align can change is to set the panel to less than 100%. So instead of 100%, I'm going to do 70%. And so now we have these panels just occupying 70% of the height. As of now, what we've been doing is we've been setting scroll snap align to start. So here, if I have the first panel up at the top and I mouse wheel scroll to the right, you can see the second panel just snaps right to the start of the container, that is. But let's go back to the first panel, and now let's try a scroll snap align value of center instead. We'll save, and we'll go back to the browser. Once again, I'm going to mouse wheel scroll to the right, and notice where that second panel stops, right in the center of the container. And now, of course, we want to try the end value. So scroll snap align end, and now let's go back to the browser, and let's see what happens when I mouse wheel scroll to the right. Well, what you can see is that this second panel here is snapping to the end of the container down here. And since it's only 70% of the height, that's why we still see some of this orange from the first panel. And again, if we mouse wheel scroll to the right, now we see that the third panel has snapped to the end of the parent container down here. By the way, I have a new course available on using GSAP and Scroll Trigger to really enhance your websites. In the course, we dive into a concept called Scrollytelling. And if you haven't heard about Scrollytelling, you're definitely going to want to check it out. You'll find the link down below in the description and the comments section. Now, if you haven't done so yet, also subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments down below what other GSAP or Scroll Trigger topics you'd like to see covered. See you next time.